So if I were to start shooting on film today, in the present day with digital being as it is, if I wanted to start learning to shoot on 35mm film, what would I start with? What's up guys, Steel Frodo here, and this is going to be a review of my personal go-to film camera. This is the Pentax K1000. So it's not a very common question to be asked. I've only been asked that question twice, but in today's whole digital era with being able to shoot a ton of photos and narrow down the ones you want and shooting on 32, 64, 128 gigabyte cards, you kind of lose the limited analog natural experience of shooting on film, which is you have 12 or 24 shots to get right, and the fewer you get right, the more film you've wasted. Whereas with digital, you can just fire off a bunch of shots and whichever one works, and you just delete the others and you've got all that space back. For beginners, the Pentax K1000 is the most entry-level, basic learning camera that can go from pretty decent to intermediate to very comfortable with shooting all manual, all analog, all the time. So this is my personal Pentax K1000. This is the SE. This is the special edition. What sets this apart from the standard Pentax K1000 is first off the natural brown leatherette grip that they used, and the fact that the focus is not actually a broken kind of dot focus pattern, but it's a split image pattern. What that means is when you go to focus on something, the split image will line up, and it's a lot easier to tell when you're in focus than whether some dots in the middle of the prism go away or not. Now the non-SE, the standard Pentax K1000, did have that vanishing dot focus type in the prism, and that is actually my dad's first SLR. That was what I started with, and I got pretty good at focusing with that kind of focus type, but once I got the split prism, it's so much easier to shoot with. Now, what makes this camera so special? Well, even with the SE, there really isn't a whole lot special about this camera, which is what makes it such a great camera. But this is the longest production SLR camera for film ever. This was manufactured from 1976 until 1997. This was in production for 21 years. And in essence, it was one of the most basic film SLR cameras you could get your hands on for almost that entire 21-year lifespan. Not only that, but it was actually pretty durable. The camera itself is an all-metal construction, so you don't really have to worry about durability too much. The lenses were very widely accepted. It was the camera to kind of introduce, or at least be a very big player in their K-style bayonet mounts for the lenses. So once they got that out into the market, you could see tons of lenses showing up from hundreds of different manufacturers that would just work with this lens because so many people could get their hands on one of these cameras. Now, when this camera was new, it had a starting price of $299.50 for some reason, and that shipped with a 55mm f2 lens. And in 1983, they introduced the 50mm f2 variant, which started at $220. Now, pretty much for most of that run, it would have just stayed at those two prices for the types of lenses it came with, but it did ship in a body-only variant, which was $210. Now, towards the end of its life, I'm guessing due to inflation, the price had gone up to $315 in 1994, and was that way till the end of its life for just the body. I'm guessing, again, inflation probably had a little bit to do with that. But in general, those prices for a camera like this were not bad. And when you look around the body of the camera, there's not a whole lot to it. And so for that price, you were getting one of the most comprehensive yet basic experiences for a starting photographer. We'll talk about the lens in a minute, but on the body itself, you essentially have two adjustments. On the top of the camera, you have a dial that kind of pulls double duty for the ASA rating and the shutter speed. The shutter speed ranges from bulb and 1 second all the way out to 1/1000th of a second, which is where the name came from. K1000, it could shoot at 1/1000th of a second, which also, unfortunately, is one of the most common speeds to fail on this camera. Normally, when you get an older camera like this, most of your speeds are pretty close, ranging from like a 30th of a second up to about 1/250th to 500th. Once you get into 1000, it tends to be more inaccurate. Fortunately, with the one that I actually got, it was pretty close, or at least it seems pretty close, and we'll get into that in a bit when I show you guys what you can do with this camera. Now, if you lift up on this dial, you can actually spin a ring inside of the dial that lets you change the ASA settings. That's going to let you know what kind of sensitivity you're shooting with for the film, and also lets the light meter know what to calibrate itself to when you go to shoot. And speaking of the light meter, this is part of why I think that this is one of the best beginner cameras for film. It is so simple. Now, I've shot with a couple other cameras that have a similar light meter configuration, and I've shot with others that have worse light meter configurations, and I've also shot with utter garbage. But one of the more complicated ones that I've shot with actually tells you what the shutter speed rating should be, and then you have to kind of look and set it to that, and then go back and shoot with whatever shutter speed it recommends. Whereas with this one, all you have to do is spin the dial and the aperture until you get the light meter somewhere in the center of the shot. So that way you know that it's properly exposed. If it goes too high, you're overexposing, and if it goes too low, you're underexposing. It's simple. It is so simple, and that's part of why I recommend it. And speaking of aperture, the aperture comes from, of course, the lens itself, and in my instance, I have two lenses. I have a 50mm f2, the variant that was introduced in 1983, but I also have one of the more popular telephoto lenses they used with this, which was a 70 to 150mm f4. Both of these lenses are fully manual focus, fully manual aperture, to partner with a fully manual body. Now, why is the whole fully manual thing important? Well, it's because when you go to shoot, you are in complete control of the shot, which you can get that with newer cameras by throwing it into manual mode, but most of the time, a lot of photographers, or rather people starting with photography, tend to just throw their camera into automatic or set a scene, and then just pull the trigger and go. With something like this, you actually have to compose the shot, figure out the lighting, set the shutter speed, figure out what depth of field you want, so you have to open the aperture more or open the aperture less, change the shutter speed, and pick the film sensitivity for the light you're shooting in. That's just something that people don't really have to worry about anymore with the whole digital automatic setup. Getting back to the camera and less about the philosophy of shooting on film, I had mentioned earlier that the type of mount it used was called the K-mount. This is a bayonet style mount, meaning that there's a button on the side to release, you press that in, you twist it, the lens comes off, you set the next one in, and twist it back the other way, and you've got yourself a brand new lens, which will talk to the camera and let it know what the light meter needs to be set to. It's pretty simple and it's pretty nice. Now, there is an automatic aperture set, which I think is kind of weird. I tried using it, and it seems to expose correctly, but it does seem to favor a bit of underexposure, and considering a lot of the film that I shot on was expired film, you really need to compensate more up, not down, and so I didn't really use the automatic function. It seemed to work pretty well, but that's not the point of this camera. To load film in it is extremely simple. On the opposite side of where your shutter speed dial is, there's a small dial with a lever on it. You lift it up. Once it pops, the entire back of the camera will open up. You can put a 35mm roll into it, pull it across, line it up with the shutter advance, not shutter advance, I keep saying shutter, the film advance lever, that's the correct terminology for it. Once the film's loaded in, you can pull the shutter advance forward a little bit, make sure that the film is catching properly on the teeth and rolling through. Close the back up. You have a couple more shots before you get to 0. There's a little window on top of the shutter advance that lets you know what shot you're on, and all you have to do is pull that forward and keep pressing the shutter button until you're at 0, and there you go. You've loaded film. Just make sure that you have it set to the right ASA, so that way when you go to shoot, the light meter knows that you're shooting on 400, 200, 1600, whatever, and that way you're not over or underexposing because you don't have it set correctly. And from a technical standpoint, that's really it about the camera. It's all metal with a fake leatherette plastic or a black sort of leather plastic thing on the regular version, and a dial for aperture, a dial for shutter, and you move the film forward. That's it. The viewfinder has the light meter that's stupid simple, and that's all. That's literally technically everything about the camera. That's all you really care about. Now, you do have a hot shoe if you want to mount a flash. You have an X sync if you wanted to actually sync other flashes with it. You do have a couple things like that. But overall, it's just a simple camera. You mount a lens to, you go out and you shoot, and that's the point. You are supposed to take this camera out and shoot, and that's exactly what I did. I went around downtown Hagerstown, and I just started taking photos. Unbeknownst to me, I was taking photos on expired film, which I could get into a whole thing about that, but let me get on a tangent here for a minute, then we'll come right back to the camera. In the same vein of, picking a camera to start shooting with for film, also don't be afraid to shoot with expired film. Just know that it's not going to get you exactly the desired shot if you are looking for a one-to-one creation of what you just took a picture of. These photos, for example, were taken with film that expired in 1997, and you can see that it got very grainy. It was very, very not sensitive at all, so you were actually sacrificing a lot of color and depth, but it has this kind of retro look to it that I really like. Anyway, that's my tangent. Don't be afraid to go shoot on expired film. Just expect it to be a little more unique than brand new film. Now, getting into slightly more advanced shooting, if you're doing something like long exposure, the shutter button actually is threaded, so you can load in a separate shutter button so that you can actually have a cable run out for it and press the button without shaking the camera if you're trying to do something like this, for example. I like that. It actually gives you a couple more options. Since it's all clockwork and mechanical, it's not going to have a timer built in by any stretch of the imagination. You can set it to a 1-second exposure, but normally you're best off just setting it to bulb and holding the shutter open until you get enough light into the film that it looks like what you're trying to get. It is a fairly heavy camera. It's not hefty, it's just got some weight to it. So if you're carrying it around in a camera bag with the lens, it's kind of heavy. If you're carrying it around on the camera strap and you're just taking shots, you eventually just forget it's there. It's like carrying around a purse, I guess, is the closest thing I can think of, but I don't carry a purse, so sure, I guess, is kind of what it looks like. I don't know. And I actually had a coworker tell me one time, I was taking it in with me to work because I was going to take some photos after work. I put it down and he said, I don't even want to touch that because it's going to, I'm afraid that it's way too expensive and I might break it. And in reality, this thing cost me $55 to buy, but it feels substantial enough for people to think that it's a very expensive camera. And you just don't get that with certain, and I know I don't want to go into the, like, they don't build them like they used to, but you just don't get that with some cameras nowadays. A lot of them are plasticky, or even Canons. Some of their best EOS Rebel series don't really have the same heft as you'd expect from other bigger, more robust cameras. It's kind of interesting that this, for $250 back in the 70s through 90s, was this was what you got for $200 or so. And nowadays you can get it for even less, and it still has that same genuinely good, solid build quality. Now, when it comes to how the photos off this camera look, I love it. It is such a old school look, but it still has that clarity of a decently new photo, and running black and whites through it is amazing as well. I love the color of, film in general, but when you go with black and white, you can really pull a subject out a lot better, make it look more defined. I don't know exactly how to describe it, but you get this very, very just basic, here's your photo, no colors to distract you. If you get the subject right, it's going to look great. And running black and white film through this was so much fun. And running color through it looked good as well. I mean, look at these shots that I was able to get. And that's not to say that everybody's going to pick one of these cameras up and immediately be like, oh, look at this amazing shot I got. But that's the point. This camera is literally for you to learn. And it has enough to it that when you learn, you can continue to shoot with it and get better and better and better. Again, when I was doing my out and about shooting, just like I did with the 50 for my Sony, I took a 50 with me for architecture photography. Doesn't really work as well, though I did manage to get a few better shots than I did with the Sony, but don't really use a 50 for architecture unless you can get really far away from your subject. In terms of sharpness, it's a pretty sharp lens, especially with things like this shot where I was stepping the aperture way, way down so that I could get a very sharp shot from close to far. And there's something about shooting with film as well on any camera where the dynamic range, when you get the exposure correct, you don't lose many shadows, as you can see here in this photo, but the sky is still in perfect color. You can see the color of the sky while not losing the shadows on the hill to the right. So when you get your exposures correctly, which when you shoot on something like this in practice is going to get easier and easier, you can get really good photos with it. The zoom lens, on the other hand, the 75 to 150, is a little bit of a different animal. It is actually one of the sharpest lenses I think I've ever shot on, period. I have a couple bigger lenses like 200, 210s, a 300, and those are good, but they get soft at a certain point. Like, just, you lose a lot of your clarity when you get that much zoom. This is just enough zoom that it stays sharp. And this photo, for example, I zoomed in from across the street to a rail car that was just kind of sitting in a field. And I think it came out really well. Now it's filmed, so the grain is going to limit you to a certain amount of clarity. But from the focus and the clarity that you got, it just shows up, and I love that. So at the end of the day, if somebody were to ask me for a third time what they would recommend for a film camera, I would highly, highly recommend a Pentax K1000. You can pick one of these up nowadays. I literally got this and this, 2 lenses and a body for $55. So that's a pretty good value to start with film photography. And if you guys really want to get into it, this is going to be my go-to camera to recommend because it is simple, it is reliable, and the one shot, this one here that shows you sort of a tree and it's kind of snowing and there's a blurred background. This camera, I'm pretty sure the 1,000th of a second shutter speed still works because you can see how it kind of froze the snow in its place. So I think it works pretty well. So reliability wise, if you can find one in good shape, you're probably better off than finding like a super old one like my dad's, which was well used but well abused. Either way, I highly recommend this camera. It is one of the best cameras I've ever shot on, period. I love my Sony to death. I love the older Canons that my family has, but this guy, when it comes to the analog feel of photography, getting the shot right within 1 of 12 or 1 of 24 exposures, making sure that you don't waste film, and making your shots count and making a shot that you're proud of, this is the go-to camera that I recommend. Otherwise, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm going to try to do at least a tech video weekly, and we'll see how that goes. We'll see if anybody cares. But I do enjoy doing these videos. I love talking about things that I do a lot with things like photography, technology. I love doing it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you guys think. Do you think you're going to pick up film photography after this? I don't really expect many to, just because, well, I don't really expect many people to. But if you do, let me know. And if you have any other questions, I'll be active in the comment section for probably the first 24 hours or thereabouts. I'll drop in every so often. But let me know what you guys think, and I will see you all in the next video. Make sure to be there and have a good one.